Something strange happened in the French Alps this past June, and almost nobody asked the right question about it. At a lakeside resort in Evian-les-Bains, the leaders of the world's richest democracies gathered for the G7 summit. Wars were on the table: Iran, Ukraine, the future of global trade. And yet, by the time the cameras packed up, the story dominating headlines wasn't about any of that. It was about a meeting that didn't happen. Every other major leader at that summit got their moment alone with the President of the United States. The host, France, got a private sit-down. Qatar got one. The UAE got one. Egypt got one. India got one. But Canada, America's oldest ally, its largest trading partner in goods, the country that sends 3/4 of everything it exports straight across that one shared border, walked away from the summit without a single formal bilateral meeting with Donald Trump. And here's where it gets strange. The Canadian Prime Minister wasn't sulking about it. He wasn't demanding answers. Mark Carney stood in front of reporters and almost laughed the question off. "I wouldn't take a big message from that," he said. He talked about having 7 or 8 informal conversations with Trump over 36 hours. Birthdays, artificial intelligence, Ukraine, Iran, everything except the one subject that actually mattered to his country's economic survival. Meanwhile, something else was happening in plain sight. Reporters covering the summit weren't writing about Trump's command of the room. They were writing about Carney's. Outlet after outlet used almost identical language. He had, in their words, upstaged the President of the United States. Again. Because this wasn't the first time. Back in January, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Carney gave a speech that made him, almost overnight, an international political star. He stood in front of the world's financial and political elite and declared that the old rules-based global order was finished, and that great powers coercing smaller ones was no longer something the world would quietly accept. Everyone understood exactly who he was talking about, even though he never said the name. He didn't need to. The room understood, the cameras understood, and once again, the coverage afterward used the same word: upstaged. So here is what everyone is asking right now. Is Mark Carney simply better at this than Donald Trump? Is this a simple story of charisma versus chaos? Of a calm technocrat outperforming a distracted president on the world stage? That's the question everyone is asking. Here is the question almost nobody is asking. If Carney is winning the spotlight this badly, this consistently, on 2 separate global stages 5 months apart, why hasn't it gotten him anything he actually needs? Because here's the part that doesn't add up. Carney isn't in Europe to win a popularity contest. He is the leader of a country whose economy is structurally, almost helplessly, tied to its relationship with the United States. Canada's free trade agreement with America is up for a mandatory review on July 1st. Trump has spent weeks publicly floating the idea that he might simply let it lapse. He has, more than once, revived his old joke that isn't really a joke, that Canada should just become the 51st state. And in the middle of all of that, his administration quietly added Canada to a list of more than 60 countries facing new tariffs over allegations of forced labor goods slipping into supply chains. So think about that combination for a second. A trade deal hanging by a thread. A president openly questioning whether your country should exist as a country. A new tariff threat layered on top of an old one. And in the middle of all that pressure, the strategy coming out of Ottawa seems to be, give a viral speech, walk into rooms full of cameras, and let the world fall in love with you. That sounds like a strange way to negotiate with someone you desperately need something from. Okay, now think about this. What if winning the room and winning the relationship are not the same game at all? What if they're not even being played on the same board? Let's start with the story everyone already knows, the one playing out in headlines and group chats. The visible story is simple, almost cinematic in its symmetry. On one side, a former central banker turned prime minister, calm, articulate, fluent in the language of markets and institutions, delivering a generational speech about defending the rules-based order. On the other side, a president who skipped straight from hosting a UFC fight night on the White House lawn for his 80th birthday into a summit about the future of the global economy. One leader looks like he's playing chess. The other looks like he's still celebrating a party from 2 days ago. The contrast writes itself, and the media, understandably, ran with it. That explanation sounds reasonable. It fits what we already believe about both men. But here is the problem. If this were simply a story about competence and charisma, Carney's winning streak should be translating into leverage. Popular leaders who outperform their counterparts on the world stage are supposed to walk away with better deals, more attention from the people who actually hold the power, more willingness from the other side to compromise. Instead, Carney left Evian with no bilateral meeting, no public commitment on the trade deal, and a tariff investigation hanging over his country that didn't exist a few months ago. Now here's where things get interesting. Reporters at the summit noticed something else, almost as an aside. A hot microphone caught Carney leaning toward Trump during a working lunch, making his case directly, off script, about a politically sensitive deal Canada had struck with China to allow a small, capped number of Chinese electric vehicles into its market at a sharply reduced tariff. Less than 3% of our market, Carney was heard saying, drawing a horizontal line with his hand to signal the limit. A cap, we capped, a hard line. And Trump's response to that, when reporters asked him about it the next day, was oddly mild. He didn't criticize the arrangement. He said he could understand it. He said he liked the structure. Sit with that for a second because it becomes important later. A few months earlier, the same president was publicly furious about this exact issue, posting that China was taking over Canada. Now, face-to-face, with cameras rolling and microphones live, his tone had softened into something closer to professional respect. That's not the reaction of two leaders locked in pure rivalry. That's the reaction of two people who understand they're negotiating something neither of them is saying out loud. Most people stop here. They see a charming prime minister, a distracted president, a missed meeting, and they file it away as just another awkward photo op in the long, messy history of Canada-US relations. But that is not the real story. The real story is happening on a battlefield most viewers never think to look at. The actual conflict here isn't happening in conference rooms in the French Alps. It's happening inside two separate, almost entirely disconnected information ecosystems, one in Ottawa, one in Washington, and the war being fought in each of them has almost nothing to do with tariffs. Here's what I mean. Mark Carney did not become prime minister because Canadians fell in love with central banking. He became prime minister because Donald Trump's rhetoric, the trade war, the talk of annexation, the public humiliation of an ally, infuriated enough Canadians that it created the exact political opening Carney needed. His entire mandate is built on the perception that he, unlike his predecessors, can stand up to Washington without flinching. That perception is not a nice to have. It is the foundation his entire government rests on. If Canadians start to believe he's gone soft, started softening his tone, in the words of more than one political analyst watching this closely, his political capital evaporates fast. Now flip to Washington. Donald Trump's entire brand, going back a decade, is built on the idea that he does not lose. He does not get outmaneuvered. He certainly does not get upstaged by the leader of a country he has openly mocked as a future American state. For his domestic audience, optics are not decoration. Optics are the message. A headline suggesting the Canadian Prime Minister stole the spotlight at his own summit is, in the language of his base, a vulnerability. So here's the hidden battlefield. Both leaders are fighting wars they cannot afford to lose, but the wars are happening in two completely different countries, in two completely different media systems, and the prize in both cases is the same thing: domestic legitimacy. The G7 stage isn't the war. It's just where the cameras happen to be pointed while the real war, the one for public opinion back home, plays out in the background. And that reframes everything you just watched. Carney's viral speeches aren't really messages to Trump. They're messages to Canadians. Proof of strength, broadcast through a global stage because a global stage is the most credible amplifier available. Trump's mild, almost conciliatory response to the EV comment isn't really about electric vehicles. It's a calculation about which battle is worth fighting publicly and which one isn't, made by a man who has to manage his own approval numbers just as carefully as Carney manages his. Which raises a bigger question. If both leaders are mostly performing for their own domestic audiences, who is actually managing the real, structural relationship between these two countries while the performance is happening? And the answer to that question is going to surprise you, because it's not who you think. Before we get there, Let's slow down and actually understand the tools both of these men are using, because once you see the underlying mechanics, you'll start noticing this exact pattern in conflicts all over the world. The first concept is cognitive warfare. This is the idea that in modern conflict, you don't always need to defeat your opponent's army, or even their economy. Sometimes it's enough to defeat their understanding of the situation, to shape what people believe is true, who they believe is winning, who they believe is strong. Carney's Davos speech wasn't a policy proposal. It barely mentioned a single concrete trade measure. It was a cognitive strike, designed to plant one idea firmly in millions of minds at once. Middle powers don't have to bow to coercion anymore. Whether or not that idea is fully true doesn't matter as much as whether people believe it, because belief shapes behavior, and behavior shapes elections, markets, and alliances. The second concept is framing theory. This is simply the idea that whoever defines the terms of a debate usually wins it, regardless of the facts underneath. Notice that Carney never directly attacked Trump by name in that Davos speech. He didn't need to. By framing the moment as a battle between the rules-based order and coercion by great powers, he forced every listener to mentally place Trump on one side of that line, without ever saying his name and risking the appearance of a personal attack. That's framing as a weapon. You're not arguing about Canada and tariffs anymore. You're arguing about whether the world still believes in fairness. Almost nobody wants to be caught on the wrong side of that frame. The third concept is signaling in game theory, and this is where the missing bilateral meeting actually makes sense. In repeated negotiations between the same two players, sometimes the most powerful move isn't an explicit threat. It's a calculated absence. Trump granting one-on-one meetings to Qatar, the UAE, Egypt, and India, while leaving Canada, his geographically closest and economically most intertwined ally, without one, sends a signal that costs him nothing to send and costs Canada plenty to receive. It says, "You are not guaranteed special treatment just because you're close to us." That's not an accident in a tightly choreographed summit. That's a message, sent without a single word. The fourth concept is asymmetric economic leverage. Canada sends roughly 75% of its exports to the United States. The United States, for all its complaints, does not depend on Canada anywhere near that heavily for its own economic survival. That imbalance means every single threat, every tariff investigation, every offhand comment about letting a trade deal lapse lands with far more force on one side of the relationship than the other. Trump can say, "We don't need anything Canada has," and mean it as a throwaway line for a domestic audience. For Carney, that same sentence is an existential threat to his country's manufacturing base. The fifth concept is deterrence through ambiguity. Trump has never said, in plain terms, that he will let Kuzma expire. He has said he's not looking to renew it. He has said the best thing about the agreement is the right to terminate it. That is not a declaration of war. It's a deliberately vague threat, designed to keep the other side anxious and off balance, without ever committing to a course of action that could backfire. Trade lawyers who watch this closely call it a classic negotiating posture. Ambiguous threats are cheap to make and expensive to ignore, which is exactly why they work. Now, remember the forced labor tariff investigation we mentioned earlier? Watch what happens when you apply these same concepts to it. The investigation covers more than 60 countries, which on the surface makes it sound like routine, broad-based trade enforcement, nothing personal. Except the report singles out Canada by name, in detailed language, claiming its border agency barely enforces its own forced labor import ban, citing a tiny number of intercepted shipments over 6 years. And around the same time, the new U.S. Homeland Security Secretary stood at a Washington think tank and warned that fentanyl trafficking was surging across the Canadian border, even though official seizure numbers along that entire border, over 7 months, came to just 6 pounds. Here's the contradiction nobody fully explained. The evidence being cited publicly is thin. The numbers don't obviously support the scale of alarm being raised. And yet the narrative, Canada as an enforcement risk, Canada as a security gap, keeps getting repeated by senior officials, on the record, at serious venues. That's not how you talk about a problem you're trying to quietly fix. That's how you build a public case for leverage you might need to use later. Remember that too, because it matters when we get to the steel man. And that brings us to the reveal most people watching this conflict completely miss. Because while everyone is fixated on the visible drama between Washington and Ottawa, there is a third player quietly benefiting from every single point of friction between them. And it isn't on either side of the table. It's China. Go back to that hot mic moment. Carney explaining to Trump almost defensively that Canada's deal allowing a small, capped number of Chinese electric vehicles into its market is tightly controlled. Just 3% of the market, a hard line, nothing to worry about. Why would a Canadian Prime Minister feel the need to personally walk the American president through the fine print of a deal with a third country, unscripted, in the middle of a working lunch about Ukraine and Iran? Because that deal is the live wire running underneath this entire relationship. The United States has slapped tariffs above 100% on Chinese EVs to protect its domestic auto industry. Canada, for a while, matched that posture exactly, with its own triple-digit tariff. Then, this year, Canada quietly cut a separate deal with Beijing, capping Chinese EV imports at a low single-digit tariff rate in exchange for the possibility, not the certainty, of Chinese investment flowing into Canadian EV manufacturing down the line. Think about what that actually means strategically. While Washington and Ottawa are locked in a very public, very personal feud over tariffs, fentanyl, forced labor enforcement, and the future of their joint trade agreement, Beijing has found a side door directly into the North American auto market, through Canada, at a moment when the US-Canada relationship is too distracted fighting itself to present a unified front on China. And here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. Trump's reaction to learning the details of this arrangement wasn't outrage, it was understanding. "I don't know that I said I like it," he told reporters afterward, "but I could understand that, yeah." A president who has built years of policy and rhetoric around confronting China economically, hearing that an ally just opened a small but real channel for Chinese vehicles to enter the continent, and responding with something close to a shrug. Why would that be? Because in the hierarchy of priorities playing out in real time, the performance war with Canada over optics, tariffs, and domestic legitimacy is for both leaders more immediately useful to manage than the long-term strategic question of China's slow infiltration of allied supply chains. China doesn't need to win a headline. China doesn't need a viral speech or a hot mic moment. China just needs the United States and Canada to stay focused on each other long enough for an EV quota to quietly become an EV pipeline. Every month that Washington and Ottawa spend negotiating over forced labor reports and bilateral snubs is a month Beijing spends building exactly the kind of foothold that's much harder to reverse than a tariff schedule. That's the hidden player. Not a villain twirling a mustache in a back room, just a government patient enough to let two allies distract each other while it builds leverage neither of them is currently positioned to stop. Now, before you walk away convinced this is all some grand, deliberate, strategic chess match, let's pause and steelman the opposite view, because the strongest case against everything we've just laid out deserves to be heard honestly. Here's that case. Maybe this is nothing more than ordinary alliance turbulence, dressed up by commentators desperate to find a hidden pattern in what is actually just routine, messy diplomacy. Summits are chaotic. Leaders have limited hours and competing priorities. The host nation traditionally gets a bilateral meeting. That's protocol, not snub. Canadian officials themselves, including a former senior Canadian diplomat who has run G7 summits before, said publicly that the lack of a formal Carney-Trump meeting wasn't meaningful, that the two men had plenty of informal time together, more time, arguably, than a single scheduled meeting would have provided. Trump's tough talk on Kuzma has a long, well-documented history of being negotiating theater rather than genuine policy intent. Trade lawyers who watch these patterns closely have said exactly that, on the record, multiple times. And his mild reaction to the China EV comment could simply reflect a busy president who hadn't been briefed on every detail of a relatively small trade arrangement, not some calculated strategic tolerance. That is a genuinely strong case, and large parts of it are true. Diplomacy is messy. Trump has a long history of loud threats that don't always become policy. None of that is in dispute. But here's where it falls apart under closer examination. This isn't a single data point. It's a pattern that repeats across two separate global stages 5 months apart. Davos in January, Evian in June, with the same outcome both times. Carney dominating coverage, Trump visibly sidelined in the narrative. Coincidence explains one data point. It does not comfortably explain two, especially when both instances align precisely with moments of maximum leverage for Carney's domestic political needs. And the forced labor tariff timing is harder to wave away as routine. The investigation singles Canada out by name in detailed, specific language, despite the broad 60-country scope, at the exact moment the CUSMA renewal deadline is approaching. U.S. trade officials have publicly and repeatedly emphasized one particular fact, that Canada and China were the only two countries in the entire world that retaliated against American tariffs during the trade war. Think about who that statement groups Canada with. Not Mexico, not the European Union, China. That is not an offhand detail. Officials choosing to repeatedly highlight that specific framing, in public, on the record, is a deliberate rhetorical move, designed to make a close ally sound in the public imagination, structurally aligned with America's primary strategic rival. That's not tough talk as negotiating tactic. That's narrative construction with a specific political purpose, built well in advance of a deadline that's going to require real leverage to use. So the Steelman is right that not everything here is a grand conspiracy, but it's wrong to conclude that none of it is strategic. The truth sitting underneath both arguments is more uncomfortable than either side wants to admit. This is a relationship where genuine structural pressure and ordinary diplomatic chaos are happening at the exact same time, layered on top of each other, which makes it almost impossible for the public to tell which moments are theater and which moments are the real negotiation. And that confusion, whether anyone planned it that way or not, benefits whoever currently holds the most leverage. So where does this actually go from here? If you want to understand what happens next before the headlines catch up, there are three specific things worth watching closely. Watch July 1st. That's the formal review date for the trade agreement holding the entire North American economy together. Trump doesn't have to terminate the deal outright to send a message. Simply letting the date pass without a renewal commitment, while continuing to talk about the right to terminate, keeps Canada in a permanent state of anxious uncertainty. The absence of a decision is, in itself, the decision that matters most to watch. Watch the forced labor tariff hearings beginning in July. These hearings will reveal whether this investigation is genuine, evidence-based trade enforcement, or a pressure tool quietly built to be activated whenever Washington needs additional leverage in the CUSMA conversation. If the rhetoric escalates right as trade talks intensify, that timing will tell you everything the official language won't. And watch Chinese investment activity in Canadian electric vehicle manufacturing. Right now, Beijing's foothold is small, deliberately capped, officially described as a possibility rather than a certainty. If that investment accelerates, while Washington and Ottawa remain consumed by their own bilateral drama, it will confirm that the real strategic shift happening in North America isn't between these two old allies at all. It's happening quietly, off to the side, while both of them are busy fighting the war they think matters most. Because here's what nobody on either side of this story wants to sit with for too long. Mark Carney has, twice now, on two of the world's biggest stages, won the room completely. He has shaped the narrative, captured the cameras, made the President of the United States look, by comparison, distracted and diminished. And it has not yet bought him a single guaranteed concession on the one issue that actually determines his country's economic future. So maybe the real question isn't who's winning this fight. Maybe it's whether being loved by the world and being respected by the neighbor you depend on most have quietly become two entirely different currencies. Currencies that no longer convert into each other the way they used to. And if that's true, then the deeper, more unsettling question isn't about Canada or Trump or even China. It's about every country watching this unfold and taking notes. In a world where attention itself has become a strategic resource, what happens to the leader who wins every room, captures every headline, dominates every cycle of global admiration, and still walks away from the table having gained nothing structural at all? What does it mean for the future of diplomacy if being seen as strong and actually holding the leverage to act strong have permanently come apart?